I can still remember the day I rolled into my new neighborhood with my trusty old work truck, the sound of the engine echoing against those pristine rows of manicured lawns. Little did I know that one vehicle would spark an all-out war with the HOA. But guess what? This story takes more twists and turns than a winding country road, and you won't believe just how far one woman named Karen will go to remove what she calls an eyesore. Stick around to find out how the fight escalates to an explosive showdown in court. Before we dive in, remember to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment below about your wildest HOA experiences. And now, let's get into the story. I moved into Greenbrier Oak Estates on a sunny afternoon, feeling somewhat proud of my accomplishment. After years of saving up, years of living frugally, I finally managed to buy a modest but comfy home for myself, my wife, and our little boy. The place was near perfect, a family-oriented community with wide streets, tall oak trees providing shade, and houses that all looked pleasantly uniform, almost too uniform, but I figured that was just the HOA being strict about their rules. My wife, Anna, was already excited about greeting our neighbors and possibly setting up weekend barbecues in our backyard. She believed that strong community bonds could turn any place into a warm, welcoming environment. But the moment we pulled up to the driveway, I noticed an older woman glaring at us from across the street. Her posture was rigid, her narrow eyes locked on my truck, an older Ford that had its share of dents and scratches, not to mention some visible rust. It wasn't pretty, but it was my livelihood. I'm a contractor by trade, specializing in carpentry and small-scale renovations. That truck held all my tools, my traveling workshop, and quite honestly, my pride. The first day I parked it there, I could feel her disapproval radiating from her yard. She stood near her hydrangea bushes, painstakingly trimmed into perfect spheres, watching, taking mental notes, and probably preparing her first complaint. A few hours later, while I was unloading wooden planks from the truck, she strutted over. With an air of self-importance, she introduced herself as Karen, the head of the Greenbrier Oak Estates HOA. She told me she was the one in charge of maintaining the community's aesthetic integrity. Those were her exact words. I forced a polite smile, trying not to be rattled by her attitude. "Pleased to meet you, Karen. I'm Sam," I said, putting down a heavy toolbox. "We're new here, obviously." She didn't bother smiling back. She gave the truck a once-over, as if assessing every stain, chip of paint, and fleck of rust. Then she replied, "Yes, I noticed. You see, we have certain standards. Work vehicles, especially large and unsightly ones, typically aren't allowed to be parked outside. It ruins the look of the neighborhood." I tried to keep my tone polite. "I understand, but from the HOA rules I read, and I made sure to review them before moving in, there was no mention of not being able to park my truck in the driveway. It's within the size limit, and it's not a commercial tractor-trailer or anything." Karen sniffed the air as though smelling something foul. "Maybe it was just assumed people wouldn't be bringing that kind of vehicle here," she said, the disdain dripping from each syllable. "But I'll be discussing this with the board." I'd had my fair share of run-ins with condescending neighbors in the past, but Karen seemed like a special brand of trouble. She didn't even try to mask her hostility, and that was day one. The next week was surprisingly quiet. I was out early in the mornings, heading to various job sites, and came back late in the evening. While my wife and son started to settle in, introducing themselves to the neighbors, exploring the local parks, I was always in and out, not seeing much of the day-to-day happenings. However, one night when I returned, a white envelope was stuck under my windshield wiper. It read, "HOA violation." Inside, it was a formal notice from the Greenbrier Oak Estates Homeowners Association, citing my truck as a violation because it was commercial in nature and displeasing to the overall look of the neighborhood. They threatened a fine if I didn't remove it from site within 48 hours. Now I knew the rules didn't say a single thing about not parking a truck outside if it was the homeowner's personal property. The only restriction I could recall was about oversized commercial vehicles or company-branded vans that exceeded a certain length or height. My old Ford didn't meet those definitions. Yes, it was used for work, but it had no large company logo, no signage, nothing that would classify it as a billboard on wheels. But that wasn't the worst of it. The letter was typed, but at the bottom was a sticky note in Karen's handwriting. "We don't want this eyesore in Greenbrier Oak. You have 2 days to comply." The word eyesore repeated in my head. I felt anger boiling in my chest. We'd worked so hard to afford a place in this community, and now I was being told to hide my means of living as though it were something shameful. The next day, instead of calling or emailing, I decided to pay Karen a visit. I walked across the street to her immaculate house, perfectly trimmed lawn, a wreath on the door, and not a single weed in sight. It was almost eerie how every blade of grass seemed to be in formation. I rang the doorbell. A few moments later, Karen opened the door. She glanced at me, took a quick look at my jeans and boots, and I could see the corner of her lip curl. "Yes," she asked, her voice carrying that same condescending tone. I held the letter up. "I received this notice about my truck." Karen nodded, her eyes drifting toward the driveway where my truck sat. "Yes, that's correct." "I'm confused," I began. "I went through the HOA guidelines and found nothing that says I can't park a pickup truck in my own driveway as long as it's within size limits, and my truck meets those limits." Karen gave me a thin-lipped smile that barely passed for polite. "It's still commercial in nature, and it's not up to the standard we uphold here." It was then that I realized logic and actual rules might not matter to her. She had a personal vendetta against the sight of my truck. Instead of pushing further, I said, "I'd like to discuss this with the board. Could you set up a meeting?" Her eyebrows rose as though she found the idea of my request laughable. "The board meets next Monday evening. You can present your concerns then." I nodded, walked away, and spent the rest of the weekend brooding about the situation. Sure, it was just a truck, but to me, it was also a symbol of my profession, my hard work, my independence. Little did I know that was only the beginning of Karen's crusade against me. In the days leading up to the meeting, more and more strange incidents started happening around my property, stray notes reminding me that I was unfit for Greenbrier Oak, rumors circulating that I was some kind of shady contractor. I could have never guessed how far Karen was willing to go to drive me out. And one particular piece of evidence I discovered would bring everything crashing down in the most unexpected way. The weekend dragged on and I couldn't shake the unease in my gut. Every time I looked out the front window, I half expected to see Karen prowling around my yard, writing up more violations. My wife tried to keep me calm. She believed that once we went before the board and explained ourselves, reason would prevail. But that Monday morning, hours before the board meeting, I found another envelope wedged in my front door. Inside was a photograph of my truck, zoomed in to highlight every scratch, dent, and patch of rust. The angle was almost mocking, as if to say, "Look how awful this thing is." There was no note, just the photo. It felt chilling, invasive. Someone took the time to snap this picture. Someone wanted me to feel intimidated. When evening came, I headed to the HOA Community Center. It was a small building near the subdivision's entrance, used mostly for official HOA business and the occasional community potluck. The board consisted of 5 members, all middle-aged to older residents who seemed to take these roles with a seriousness that rivaled city governance. Karen was obviously at the head of the table, flanked by 2 other women who seemed equally prim and stern, and 2 men who looked a bit more approachable but still distant. I presented my case calmly, stating that the HOA rules did not explicitly ban my vehicle. I'd done my homework, citing specific paragraphs, showing printed copies of the relevant sections. I even had photos of other pickup trucks in the neighborhood, though admittedly much newer and shinier, to prove I wasn't the only one. Karen sat there with her arms folded, lips pressed tight. Once I finished, Karen launched into her rebuttal, claiming that her interpretation was that commercial vehicles included any used primarily for work. She went on a tangent about how the community took pride in a certain ambience, and how my truck's appearance clashed with that ambience. Her language was flowery and grandiose, making it sound like my battered Ford was a personal affront to the entire community. When she was done, I looked around the table, hoping to see some understanding. One of the male board members, James, cleared his throat. "I understand both perspectives," he said. "Sam's done the reading, and based on the literal guidelines, his truck isn't prohibited. However, Karen makes a point that we want to keep the neighborhood visually appealing." I was about to speak when Karen cut in. "We could propose an amendment to the HOA guidelines that clarifies the definition of commercial vehicles. If we do that, Sam would have to comply." My heart sank, so this was her game. She couldn't cite an existing rule, so she wanted to create one. Before a final decision could be made, the board agreed to give me a chance to remedy the situation voluntarily, perhaps by storing the truck in the garage or parking it elsewhere. I argued that the truck wouldn't fit well in my garage once I factor in my tools, and I needed daily access to it. As for parking elsewhere, that was impractical and expensive if I had to rent a separate space. Karen then set a deadline. We'll revisit this in 2 weeks. If by then there is no progress, we'll consider an emergency vote on an amendment. I left the meeting more frustrated than ever. Karen was weaving a web of rules around me, and she knew exactly how to do it. Over the next few days, more letters and friendly reminders appeared at my door. The fines began piling up, first $50, then $100, eventually ballooning to $500 for noncompliance. Each notice was carefully worded, always referencing some vaguely interpreted standard. I was also hearing from neighbors that Karen was going door to door, telling them how my truck was bringing down property values. A few neighbors sympathized with me, some stayed out of it, and others seemed to buy Karen's narrative. Late one night, I decided to sit down with Anna and weigh my options. Could we fight the HOA? Could I threaten them with legal action? Did we have the finances for a lawyer if it came to that? Our savings were mostly tied up in the house. Then, as if answering my silent question, I found a YouTube video titled "Fighting Your HOA in Court." Watching it gave me a bizarre sense of hope and panic at the same time. HOAs can be powerful, but they're not infallible. If they're stepping outside the bounds of their own governing documents or state law, they can be challenged. That night, I realized I needed an attorney, someone who understood real estate and HOA law. So I contacted an old friend who had gone to law school with me for a year before I switched to a trade school. He pointed me toward a local lawyer named Meredith Brown, a specialist in property disputes. Our phone call was enlightening. She said my best bet would be to document every interaction with Karen, gather all letters and fines, and ensure that the HOA is strictly following its own guidelines. If they're not, I'd have grounds for a case. I spent the next week gathering my arsenal. Anna helped me sort through every piece of correspondence. Meanwhile, Karen upped her game. She started standing on the sidewalk, snapping photos of my truck every morning as I left for work. She'd glare and occasionally even wave at me sarcastically with her phone in hand. Another open loop. Was she building a file to show the board that my truck was unacceptable at all hours? Possibly. However, in her zeal, Karen slipped up. One Friday morning, as I was backing out of my driveway, I heard a thud. Panicked, I stopped, jumped out, and found Karen sprawled on the ground behind my truck, her phone clutched in her hand. I rushed over. "Are you okay?" I asked, concerned, but she hissed at me. "You nearly ran me over." I was perplexed. Why was she standing so close to my truck? And then it dawned on me. She was trying to get a close-up photo or maybe even stage something. A neighbor across the street saw the whole thing and shouted, "Hey, Karen, you were behind his truck. He had no idea you were there. You walked right up to his bumper." Karen scowled, got up, and marched away without another word. The neighbor gave me a sympathetic shrug. That weekend, I received a text from Meredith, my lawyer. "Sam, I have reason to believe your HOA is targeting you unfairly. Let's set up a meeting." When we met, she explained that she'd looked into Greenbrier Oak Estates and found other instances where Karen had singled people out, particularly for what she deemed eyesores. But rarely had she gone as far as changing the rules post hoc. This was unprecedented. Meanwhile, the daily harassment was taking a toll on my family. My son asked me why the mean lady kept taking pictures of our house. My wife, who initially believed in friendly resolution, was now anxious whenever she saw Karen outside. Then came the day Karen decided to paint me as a safety hazard. She claimed my truck was leaking fluids onto the street, a lie that she tried to bolster with a photo of a small puddle of water near the curb. I suspect she might have poured something there herself, but proving that was difficult. The HOA slapped me with another violation for polluting common areas. Enough was enough. I filed a complaint with the local municipality, stating harassment and defamation. Meredith drafted a cease and desist letter, which we sent to Karen and the HOA board. We demanded all fines be put on hold until the matter could be resolved. That's when Karen truly lost it. She orchestrated an emergency meeting for all residents to decide on an amendment banning commercial and unsightly vehicles from driveways outright. On the night of the emergency meeting, the community center was packed. People were clearly curious. Some were supportive of me, while others were worried about property values. Karen, in her usual flamboyant manner, began the meeting by showing a slideshow of what she called the problem. She had pictures of my truck from every angle, even comparing it to bright, shiny SUVs. The word eyesore flashed on the screen in bold red letters as if we were on some reality show. I could feel my heart pounding. At one point, she said, Look at this example of disrepair. It's only a matter of time before more people think they can park wrecks in their driveway. We must act now to preserve our neighborhood." A few people clapped, but many others seemed uncomfortable. Meredith stood up to speak on my behalf. She calmly explained that the existing HOA covenants did not support Karen's stance, that I was a homeowner with rights, and that changing rules to target a single individual is not only unethical but potentially unlawful. She concluded by saying, "If this amendment passes, we will be taking legal action, and we have ample evidence of harassment and bad faith enforcement." The room buzzed with murmurs. I saw the two male board members exchange glances. Karen tried to maintain her composure, but I noticed a slight tremor in her voice when she resumed. "Let's vote," she said, her eyes scanning the room. The votes were tallied. The majority of the residents either abstained or voted against the amendment. Karen's motion failed. She fumed, but she couldn't dispute the results. That night I thought maybe things would calm down, but I was wrong. Karen was not finished with me yet. Over the next few weeks, the harassment got more personal. Late-night knocks on my door where nobody was there when I answered, anonymous letters telling me I wasn't Greenbrier material, even a suspicious scratch that appeared on my truck's door one morning. My wife wanted to install security cameras, but ironically, we'd both seen stories of HOAs that often disapproved of cameras facing public streets. Then came the final straw. I received a lawsuit notice from the HOA, signed by Karen, accusing me of violating the community's codes and seeking to collect unpaid fines that totaled thousands of dollars. They claimed I was in breach of contract by not complying with their reasonable requests. It was the ultimate power move, dragging me into court. Meredith was both furious and somewhat excited because now we'd get to present everything: Karen's letters, the staged photos, the trespassing attempts in front of a judge. Once the date was set, the tension in the neighborhood skyrocketed. Some neighbors openly supported me, while others avoided eye contact, clearly frightened by Karen's influential position. 2 days before the hearing, as I was leaving for work, I saw Karen at the corner of my property. She gave me a smug smile as if to say, "I've got you." That smile turned my anxiety into determination. I had to see this through, not just for myself, but for my family's peace of mind. Court day arrived, and the small claims courtroom was surprisingly crowded for such a local matter. Karen sat at one table with another HOA board member and their attorney. Meredith and I sat at the other. The judge, a middle-aged woman with a stern but fair demeanor, asked both sides to present their arguments. Karen's side went first, claiming I was in flagrant violation of the community's standards, that my truck lowered property values, and that the fines were legitimate. Their attorney tried to paint me as an uncooperative neighbor who refused multiple offers to comply. Meredith then systematically tore down each point, referencing the actual HOA bylaws, highlighting the lack of any specific rule banning my truck, and introducing screenshots of Karen's ominous texts and letters. She even provided statements from neighbors who'd witnessed Karen's attempts to provoke me. Finally, she presented evidence that I'd repeatedly offered to discuss a compromise, but Karen had refused any real dialogue. As the session wore on, I saw Karen's facade crack. She interrupted once or twice, drawing the judge's ire. By the time Meredith was done, the judge was clearly unimpressed with Karen's vendetta. In a decisive ruling, the judge declared that I was not in violation of any existing covenant. Moreover, the judge admonished the HOA for levying fines based on an interpretation that wasn't supported by their own documents. She ordered the immediate cancellation of all fines and placed an injunction against the HOA from enforcing any new rules that specifically targeted my vehicle. The sense of relief that washed over me was profound. Karen looked as if she wanted to vanish. The judge even hinted that if the HOA continued with such actions, I could countersue for harassment. After the ruling, a few reporters from a local paper, who'd apparently caught wind of a David versus Goliath-style HOA dispute, approached me. I gave them a simple statement: "I'm just glad the judge saw the facts for what they were. I hope we can move forward peacefully." But the story doesn't end there. As we packed up our documents and left the courtroom, Karen brushed past us, her gaze fixed straight ahead. She made no apologies, no acknowledgments. People in the halls stared at her. I heard one of the board members whisper, "Karen, enough is enough, we're done with this." In the weeks that followed, the board took steps to restructure. Karen was quietly stripped of some of her responsibilities, though she remained in the neighborhood. I saw her occasionally peering through her curtains, watching my truck parked confidently in my driveway. She never said another word to me, and I assumed she'd learned her lesson. A month later, we received official notice that Karen had resigned from her position as the HOA president. Rumor had it she was facing internal pressure after the lawsuit debacle and the negative media attention. Some neighbors even approached us to apologize for not standing up sooner, admitting they were afraid of Karen's intimidation tactics. As for me, I still drive my old Ford, and I take special pride in parking it out front. It's more than a truck, it's a reminder that no one, not even a self-appointed neighborhood tyrant, can take away my right to live and work in peace. Thank you for joining me on this roller coaster of an HOA showdown. If you enjoyed this story, please hit that subscribe button so you don't miss out on more tales of over-the-top neighbors. Leave a like if you were cheering for me in court, and drop a comment about the wildest HOA rule you've ever heard. Your support keeps this channel going. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.